Massive rule changes on the scale we're seeing in 2022 in Formula 1 are rare. Although they have become a little more frequent in recent times, it's still unusual for there to be overhauls so widespread that it impacts not just the look of the cars, but even sometimes the style of racing and the competitive order. In this video, we rank the most game-changing new regulation packages in history. By packages, we mean a raft of changes made between seasons, rather than those made during the year. For the best of those, check out our video, 10 times F1 rules were changed during a season. The order is dictated by how far-reaching the rule changes were in terms of engine, chassis concept, and the nature of F1. This means we're looking at what might be called the modern era of F1 over the past 4 decades, simply because this is when the regulations have become increasingly far-reaching. This is why big changes such as the switch to 1500cc engines in 1961 and the return to power 5 years later with 3-litre engines miss out. While they did have a big impact on the competitive order, they didn't have so immediate and profound an effect on the cars themselves. Formula 1's great turbocharged era spluttered into life with the arrival of the Renault RS01 in 1977. It peaked with every car on the grid running such engines in 1986, but ended in 1988 with the all-conquering McLaren Honda MP44. The phasing out of turbos had already begun before that, and only 6 teams out of 18 ran forced induction engines in 1988. While the rules aimed for parity with normally aspirated engines thanks to a 2.5 bar boost pressure limit and a race fuel allowance of 150 litres, turbo engines still ruled the roost, taking 4 of the top 5 positions in the Constructors' Championship. But in 1989, everyone had to run normally aspirated engines, and the supremacy of the turbos the year before showed just how big an impact the changes had. The long fight to regain turbo-era horsepower levels began, with the sight of airboxes again becoming familiar at the front, having been missing on most of the leading cars the year before. McLaren Honda stayed on top, but a new force started to rise, with Williams Renault emerging as a race winner. Formula 1 bafflingly decided that an increase in downforce levels to make the cars 5 to 6 seconds faster was the solution to all its ills. This led to the introduction of wider cars with more powerful aerodynamics in 2017. The cars got wider by 20 cm, the tyres got bigger by 6 cm at the front and 8 cm at the back, with the rear wing widened by 20 cm and made 15 cm lower to make the car sleeker. The rear diffuser was also made bigger for more powerful underfloor aero, meaning the cars had significantly more downforce and were a lot faster. Mercedes remained the dominant team, albeit winning only 12 races compared to the year before, with its advantage cut to around a quarter of what it had been in 2016. But while the results were similar, much had changed. Not only were the aerodynamicists working in new areas, but the wider cars caused some teams, notably Red Bull, wind tunnel problems thanks to the increased proximity of the wider models to the tunnel walls. Electronic driver aids became increasingly common in Formula 1 during the early years of the 1990s, culminating in the all-conquering Williams Renault FW15C, in which Alain Prost won the 1993 World Championship. That car featured active suspension, traction control and ABS brakes, all of which were outlawed for 1994, along with other technologies that weren't being raced but were being explored, such as 4-wheel steering and continuously variable transmission. This not only made life more difficult for the drivers, as well as setting the stage for the controversy that was to follow in 1994 about alleged use of such technology, but also impacted the cars. Williams famously struggled to readapt to passive suspension and suffered from aerodynamic instability, particularly in the first half of the season. Refuelling, which had been banned at the end of 1983, was also introduced. That not only meant smaller fuel tanks, but also fundamentally changed the nature of racing into a series of sprints between pit stops. These changes also allowed a new force to arise, with Michael Schumacher and Benetton taking their first world championships. The look of Formula 1 cars changed profoundly in 1998, with cars reduced in width by 20 cm to 1.8 metres and the introduction of grooved tyres. This was all part of FIA President Max Mosley's push to reduce grip levels in the name of safety. Narrower cars meant less opportunity to generate downforce, while the addition of 3 grooves in the front tyres and 4 in the rear reduced the available grip. The cars were slower in 1998 at the majority of circuits where a fair comparison is possible, but only by 0.8 of a second on average. However, the teams rapidly clawed back pace as the season progressed. These changes set the shape of F1 cars for the next decade, with a fourth groove added to the front tyres in 1999 and slick tyres not returning until 2009. And the cars didn't get wider again for almost 2 decades. We're halfway through our rundown of F1's biggest rule changes, and we'll get back to the most significant regulation rewrites of all in a moment. But first, we wanted to thank you for watching our video and remind you that if you want to make sure you don't miss anything from the race, hit the subscribe button. Subscribing to the race and hitting the thumbs up to show you like our videos really does help us to do what we do. It ensures we'll keep producing our videos about F1, past, present and future. The dramatically different aerodynamic regulations introduced in 2009 transformed the proportions of F1 cars. The high, narrow rear wings and wide snowplow front wings gave F1 a grating new look, designed to make it easier to follow another car closer and improve overtaking. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So big were these changes that Red Bull's design legend Adrian Newey described them at the time as the biggest since the flat bottom rules of 1983. They certainly shook up the competitive order, with the Brawn team that rose from the ashes of Honda producing the legendary Brawn BGP 001 that Jenson Button took to the World Championship. It was also a rule set that resulted in all sorts of innovations, notably the double diffuser that proved so controversial at the start of 2009, and designs such as the F-duct that followed in 2010. And it wasn't just the cars that changed, as for the first time, F1 engines incorporated a hybrid element. The Kinetic Energy Recovery System, or KERS, permitted an extra kick of 80 brake horsepower for just under 7 seconds a lap. Unfortunately, the rules didn't entirely work as planned. The attempt to simplify the aerodynamics simply led to teams finding unregulated areas to exploit, for example by cutting back the side pods to make space for bargeboard components, and ultimately did little to tackle the problem of a lack of overtaking. In fact, it heralded the beginning of aerodynamic outwash, which made the problem even worse. The arrival of the 1.6-litre V6 turbo hybrid engines in 2014 allowed Mercedes to start its era of dominance. But while the engine change was significant, it's often forgotten that it also led to big changes to the car, both in terms of structure and aerodynamics, with a narrower front wing, wider side pods and loss of the rear beam wing. But the power unit, as it was now called, was key. Mercedes had been the first to start experiments with the new rules, stretching back to single-cylinder tests 4 years earlier. A combination of that and the fact the team had emerged as a race-winning force in 2012 and 13 meant the timing was perfect. The rules package completely transformed F1. The reintroduction of a fuel allowance for the first time since 1988, with 100 kilos allowed to cover the race distance, combined with the complicated energy recovery systems, meant there was a huge amount of management required of the available resources. When Lotus introduced ground effect aero to Formula 1 in 1977, refining the concept with the all-conquering Lotus 79 that dominated the following season, a revolution began. But at the end of 1982, amid concerns about rising cornering speeds, the flat bottom regulations effectively banned underwing section ground effect cars and side skirts. The rules did exactly what the name suggests, with the underbody Venturi profiles outlawed and a uniform flat underfloor required. Side skirts were also banned, making it impossible to seal the low pressure area under the floor. While there was still a small part of the floor that could be used in this way with a rear diffuser beneath the gearbox and rear wing, this switched the emphasis back to top body aerodynamics in F1. In doing so, it undid much of the previous half-decade of evolution, and in some cases initially cost cars more than half their downforce. But inevitably, F1 designers found ways to regain the lost downforce, and lap times quickly started to drop again. We heard earlier about Adrian Newey calling the 2009 rule changes the biggest since the flat bottoms of 1983. Well, that has been superseded by the 2020 rule changes, which the design legend has dubbed the biggest in 40 years. Given his technical brilliance, who are we to argue, which is why 2022 has to be number one in our video. The 2022 technical regulations are the most prescriptive on record, with every aspect of the car tightly regulated. It doesn't mean F1 has become one make as some have suggested, but it does leave less room for innovation than ever before. The driving force behind the car changes is that old chestnut of making it easier to follow closely and therefore overtake. That explains the dramatically simplified aero surfaces, with the front and rear wing less powerful, barge boards eliminated entirely, and all the flicks and vanes that have become so popular with designers no longer allowed. A big slice of the car's downforce will be generated by the ground effect Venturi tunnels down each side of the car. And completing the transformation of the car's looks, there's also the switch to 18-inch wheel rims. But the changes stretch beyond that. The technical regulations were originally conceived to work hand in hand with F1's cost cap, but were put back for a year thanks to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The financial regulations weren't delayed, but have to be considered as part of the same set of rule changes aimed at making F1 a more level playing field. No set of rule changes has so dramatically impacted the cars, the on-track racing, and the way the teams work off-track. That makes 2022 the biggest set of rule changes in F1 history.